Before Homo habilis, the earliest member of our genus, evolved in the early Pleistocene, the world was in the Pliocene Epoch. The Pliocene lasted from roughly 5.3 to 2.5 million years ago, and while the remote forests of Africa were home to our early australopithecine ancestors, this was a world where large carnivores and hoofed mammals reigned supreme. During the Pliocene, the world had begun to get cooler and drier, and clear seasons were established. Sea levels across the world were around 25 meters or 82 feet higher than they are today, and the world was between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius warmer on average. As the world cooled even more towards the start of the Pleistocene, glaciers and ice sheets began to form over the North Pole, and the stage was set for the eventual ice age after humans had evolved. In today's video, we find ourselves in a world of waning forests and expanding grasslands, where large animals adapted to open conditions were able to evolve to suit these new surroundings. Join us as we travel back through time across the entire Pliocene Epoch, going from continent to continent as we examine the most iconic and unusual residents of each. So sit back and relax as we take a trip through a land before humanity. During the Pliocene, Europe was a land of receding boreal forests. Open woodlands gave way to plains and grasslands as the temperature cooled, with former subtropical conditions disappearing. The Alps would fold and grow throughout the course of the Pliocene, allowing animals suited to open and upland conditions to become very successful. The open grasslands of Europe would have been reminiscent of those we see in sub-Saharan Africa today, with gigantic proboscideans, ancient relatives of modern elephants, shaping the environments in which they lived. An impressive example was the Anancus, a type of proboscidean known as a gomphothere. Standing at around 2.5 meters, or over 8 feet tall at the shoulder, this creature was comparable in both size and weight to living African bush elephants. The most striking feature of these animals were, of course, the tusks, which projected out straight in front of their heads, and were longer than those of modern-day elephants. Anancus would wander the grasslands, feeding on fruit, bark, and twigs, using its mobile trunk to bring food into its mouth. It coexisted on the grasslands of Pliocene Europe with a variety of other proboscideans, including the southern mammoth, a species that exceeded the size of modern elephants, reaching up to 4 meters or over 13 feet tall at the shoulder. The southern mammoths of the Pliocene, living in a world that was warmer than the Pleistocene, did not need a woolly coat of fur and were largely hairless. It was one of many large European species that would survive the end of the Pliocene and live into the early stages of the Pleistocene, however. Across these same grasslands, ancient relatives of rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and giraffes also thrived. Between them lived groups of archaic warthog-like pig species, monkeys, and extravagantly adorned deer, known as Euclidosaurus. Also known as the bush-antlered deer, this genus was known for its giant branching antlers that resembled the limbs of trees. It would have lived across the open woodlands of Pliocene Europe, browsing on trees and shrubs. It would have needed to be careful, however, as multiple species of saber-toothed cat also lived in Europe at this time. The likes of Meganteridon, with their long knife-like canine teeth, stalked through the grasslands, ambushing medium to large hoofed animals. The oceans and coastlines of Pliocene Europe were equally bursting with life. In the North Sea, off the coast of what would one day become northern England, Platalia rostrum lived in energetic pods, dancing through the water as it picked off fish and shellfish. This animal, also known as the blunt-snouted dolphin, was an early relative of modern killer whales, although it looked much more like a pilot whale. The most striking feature of Platalia rostrum was the huge balloon-like structure atop its head. Much like the melons of modern-day dolphins, this would have been a fatty structure used for focusing and directing sound, which would help the animal to echolocate prey. Baleen whales would have also lived in these waters. Balaenula, a small filter feeder that lived in waters off the coast of what would one day become Belgium and Italy, was common. Unlike the giants that drift through our seas today, Balaenula was relatively small, measuring between 6 to 8 meters or 20 to 26 feet in length. And speaking of small animals, the coastlines of Europe were populated by colonies of Prepusa. These seals were the smallest in the fossil record, and were rather common across coastal deposits in Europe during the Pliocene. Fossils have been unearthed from the Netherlands and Hungary, where they thrived in the Paratethys, the remnants of the archaic Tethys Sea that covered much of mainland Europe and Western Asia. Finding safety in numbers, these little piscivores would have darted gracefully between rocky shorelines and beds of seagrass, picking off fish to eat. Pliocene Europe wasn't without its oddities too. In what would one day become France and Spain, Pliohyrax lived in small herds. Today, modern hyraxes are no larger than a rabbit, but Pliohyrax could reach sizes in excess of 1.4 meters, or 4.5 feet from nose to tail. It ambled through the grasslands, feeding on leaves, fruits, stems, and tubers. Despite the complete lack of resemblance, these animals' closest relatives were elephants and manatees. Elsewhere, in what would one day become the Balearic island of Minorca, the highlands and meadows were home to Neuralagus, the largest species of rabbit in the fossil record. 10 times the weight of an extant European rabbit, Neuralagus was capable of reaching such sizes due to insular gigantism, where animals isolated from the mainland evolved in unorthodox ways due to a lack of predators or competition. While many of the mainland animals of Europe found their way into the grasslands and forests of Asia as well, this vast continent had many unique animals to offer during the Pliocene. The Indian subcontinent was a particularly species-rich area at this time, with a mix of open grasslands, woodlands, and tropical forests to harbour a massive variety of life. One of the most iconic animals of Pliocene India was, without a doubt, Civatherium, one of the largest giraffids in the fossil record. It resembled a large, heavily built okapi, standing 3 meters or just under 10 feet tall. Unlike modern giraffes, Civatherium was capable of grazing, with higher crowned teeth that would not wear down as quickly as those in its living relatives, but it was also a capable browser. Given its long neck, it would have been able to reach leaves which other species couldn't. It's this adaptability that saw it live well into the Pleistocene epoch, where it was actually preyed upon by Homo erectus. Pliocene India was also home to bizarre carnivores at this time, namely giant viverids. Today, viverids are small arboreal carnivores that include genets, civets, and their relatives. But in the Pliocene, some viverids grew very large. Vishnuictis was a prime example, capable of reaching the size of a modern wolf. It was most likely omnivorous, filling a similar ecological niche to bears, capable of hunting when it needed to. Heading northwest towards the lands that now make up the India-Pakistan border, a theoretical time traveller to the Pliocene would have been able to marvel at the gigantic shells of Megalocalis, the largest known tortoises in the fossil record. The largest individuals of this genus had shells that measured up to 2 meters or 6.5 feet in length, with the largest weight estimates reaching up to 4,000 kilograms, or just shy of 9,000 pounds. It's more likely, however, that on average, these reptiles could reach weights of around 1,000 kilograms, or just over 2,000 pounds, given studies on the volumetric displacement of the skeleton. The lower carapace of these tortoises, underneath the neck, were forked and extremely robust, which has led scientists to believe they may have used them as clubs or prongs to fight for territory or the right to mate. This is another species that lasted through the end of the Pliocene and well into the Pleistocene, when Homo erectus are believed to have wiped them out entirely when they left Africa. Some sites in Pliocene Asia were home to late surviving calicotheres, perhaps some of the most strangest hoofed mammals in the fossil record. Nestoritherium is one such animal, which would have resembled an uncanny mix of horse and ground sloth, being related to the former. It lived in China, Myanmar, and Indonesia throughout the entirety of the Pleistocene, likely in open woodlands where it had reliable access to fresh browsing. While this ungulate walked on all fours, it would have used its forelimbs to manipulate its food, which would have included leaves and fruits. This is unique in hoofed mammals, and the calicotheres would have been a particularly unusual sight as they ambled through the woodlands of ancient Asia. The most notable change to the fauna of Africa during the Pliocene was the rise of the bipedal hominins, our earliest upright ancestors that conquered the open woodlands and plains, using high intelligence and the use of basic tools. The first of these upright apes were the australopithecines, of which several species were present in Africa during the Pliocene. The most notable and widespread was Australopithecus, one of the first apes in the fossil record to walk upright, leaving the safety of the trees for extended periods of time to take to the fringes of woodland and grassland in Africa's Rift Valley. Still covered in a layer of fine fur, these animals bore the traits of both humans and non-human great apes. They were not as tall as modern humans, nor did they have the ability to develop intricate stone tools, but they were well on their way to giving rise to the first true human species. Of course, on these plains they were not yet apex predators, and thus needed to be wary of a whole host of hungry carnivores. A significant and persistent threat to Australopithecus would have been the series of saber-toothed feline ambush hunters that stalked through the long grass and woodlands of Pliocene Africa. Dinophilis was one of the most common and deadly, roughly the size of a leopard or jaguar, and was actually already widespread across the world while Australopithecus was first coming down from the trees. For a saber-toothed cat, its fangs were relatively short, but were more robust than those of other species. There is evidence in the fossil record of puncture holes on the skulls of Paranthropus, a more robustly built hominin that matched the tooth patterns and shape of Dinophilis. This is thought to have been a semi-rare occurrence, however, and the cat likely preferred to hunt hoofed mammals in open terrain. Leopards and the aforementioned Megantirodon, which was also found in Eurasia, were some of the most prolific hunters of early Australopithecines during the Pliocene. Predators throughout the early phases of the African Pliocene were a little more unusual than just saber-toothed cats. Antelopes that were looking for a quick drink at the water's edge in what would one day become Kenya needed to be wary of, believe it or not, otters. However, these weren't the regular cute piscivores we see today, but lion-shaped apex predators that burst from the water's edge to grab their prey. The genus in question, Enhydriodon, is most closely related to the sea otter of modern times, which has been determined from scientists by looking at its dentition, although Enhydrodon's teeth were much larger and more robust. The African species of Enhydrodon are the largest mustelids in the fossil record, and while it's uncertain exactly what they preyed upon, they were likely unfussy eaters. Clams, catfish, reptiles, birds, and terrestrial hoofed mammals were all potential menu items for the larger Enhydrodon species. Another particularly intimidating animal from the Pliocene of Africa was Dinopithecus, a huge relative of modern baboons. One that was 3 to 4 times the size of living mandrills, the largest species of baboon. While most modern baboons feed on leaves, grasses, and stems as the bulk of their diet, Dinopithecus seems to have enjoyed fruit. Like most species of modern baboon, it was probably reasonably aggressive, and given its size, would have been able to readily defend itself against predators. It likely spent most of its time on the ground, and did not climb trees as much as the smaller primates of Pliocene Africa. Other large primates of the region included Kenyanthropus, a species of early hominin, and Theropithecus, another large relative of baboons. Amongst the trees, monkeys such as Ceropithecoides, a relative of modern colubuses, would have foraged for fruit and nuts, able to deftly avoid the danger below by jumping from branch to branch. Australia, prior to the onset of the Pleistocene, where the iconic megafaunal marsupials and giant reptiles emerged, was a land of relatively small creatures. Its rocks are not the most prolific when it comes to Pliocene age fossils, but several genera are known that acted as the precursors to the likes of the giant kangaroos that occupied the region when humans first arrived. One of the most well-known animals of Pliocene Australia is Ambulator, a species of diprotodontid that lived in the Tirari Formation of South Australia. While smaller than the likes of Diprotodon that would evolve during the Pleistocene, Ambulator was still large, a bulky quadruped that thrived in open woodlands and plains in dry conditions. In life, it would have resembled something between a hippopotamus and a bear, but was related to neither. Its closest living relatives are the wombats that live in Australia today. Perhaps the strangest resident of Pliocene Oceania could be found in the trees. Today, tree kangaroos are a little known but fascinating group of marsupials that spend almost their entire lives amongst the branches of the trees, where they feed on fruit and leaves. They resemble kangaroos, yet move more like sloths, inching along branches step by step to locate a meal. They are not large animals, the largest being no bigger than a wallaby, but in the Pliocene this was not quite the case. Bora paulae was the largest species of tree kangaroo in the fossil record, roughly the size of an adult human and weighing between 35 to 45 kilograms, or between 77 to 104 pounds. It lived in the regions of Australia that are now covered in shrubland and outback, but in Bora's day were covered with dense foliage. Due to its weight, it would have needed to be picky about the trees it climbed on and the food it sought. Its bones show the same adaptations for climbing seen in modern tree kangaroos, so it was definitely arboreal. This was another species that persisted into the Pleistocene, living in Australia until around 22,000 years ago. In the forests and scrublands, animals much more familiar had evolved. Pliocene relatives of modern kangaroos, bandicoots, and even echidna could be found across the country, making up an intricate ecosystem of animals that were beginning to grow much larger than their ancestors. By the time the Pleistocene rolled around, some of these animals will be truly colossal, capable of reaching sizes larger than modern humans. For now, however, in their human-free world, they could forage with relatively few predators, and begin to adapt into all kinds of shapes and sizes. During the Pliocene, North America was a land of newly formed mountain ranges, wide open plains, and rich woodlands. Prior to the Pliocene, North America was not connected to South America, but around 3 million years ago, the two drifted together, becoming connected by the Isthmus of Panama, that thin snaky strip of land that today contains the countries of Panama, Honduras, and Nicaragua. This led to an event known as the Great American Biotic Interchange, which allowed animals from both the north and south to migrate via this new land bridge. South American animals colonized North America for the first time, and vice versa. Amongst the most impressive animals to travel from south to north were the terror birds, a group of gigantic predatory avians who were the closest the world has ever got to returning to the large predatory dinosaurs since their extinction event 66 million years ago. The best known North American species was Titanus, a bird that stood up to 2 meters or 6.5 feet tall. Its skull is one of the largest and most formidable looking of any known bird in the fossil record, with a gigantic hooked beak that was used for tearing at flesh. In South America, they were doing extremely well before the connection of the Americas. But as groups of saber-toothed cats began to filter down into the south, they would inevitably lose their position as apex predators by the time that humans arrived in the New World. The main prey items of the terror birds, as well as the saber-toothed cats, would have been hoofed mammals, and there were plenty of them out on the North American plains. Horses were in abundance here, and several genera are known from the Pliocene. Many of these genera, such as Homo were small, measuring no longer than 90 centimeters or just 3 feet. These were fast, lightweight animals, perfectly adapted to darting out of harm's way when the need arose. Much more common and widespread was Dinohippus, a slightly larger animal that was adapted to standing and running for long periods of time. Some species of Dinohippus had just 1 digit on their feet, whereas others had 3, making them one of the last horse genera before these animals gradually evolved 1 hoof per foot. Their range spread right through to the rainforests of Mexico during the Pliocene, where they fed on forest plants and deftly avoided the claws and fangs of big cats. Out on the plains, proboscideans were common. All manner of elephant-like herbivores lived in Pliocene North America, from gomphotheres to mastodons. Cuvieronius was amongst the most widespread and well-known, a gomphothere that could reach heights of up to 2.5 meters or 7.5 feet at the shoulder. Roughly as massive as an Asian elephant, this browser used its broad shovel-like tusks and long flexible trunk to pick up food from the grasslands and woodland borders. This proboscidean's fossils were amongst the first to be studied in America, and studies show that while this animal survived into the Pleistocene, it was hunted to extinction by the early humans that crossed over the Bering Land Bridge, bringing spears and fire with them. Not every animal in these grasslands was large, however, and the Pliocene of North America was home to the bizarre Ceratogolus, a genus of burrowing rodent with 2 conical horns situated between its nose and eyes. These horns may have played a part in defending these little creatures from attack, while their powerful claws performed most of the digging work. With poor eyesight, they were adapted to a life underground, feeding on invertebrates and tubers within the soil of the grasslands. Arguably the most famous animal of the entire Pliocene, Otodus megalodon, was known from the coast of North America. Although it lived worldwide, the remains of its teeth are particularly frequent at coastlines across the United States and Central America. This gigantic shark capable of reaching between 15 and 18 meters, or between 50 to 60 feet in length, was one of the most impressive apex predators ever to have lived on planet Earth. It lived in coastal waters where it targeted animals as large as baleen whales, ploughing into them with gigantic serrated teeth. Young megalodons were raised in nurseries in sheltered regions amidst shallow kelp forests, which would have been abundant along the Pacific coastline of North America. As the sharks matured, they would swim out to more open waters along the coast, where more reliable sources of food could be found. South America is something of a paleontologist's dream when it comes to Pliocene age fossils, and the continent's rocks from across this time contain some of the most notable, iconic, and bizarre animals of the Cenozoic. The coastlines of what would one day become the country of Peru were particularly biodiverse. Fossils from the country's Pisco Formation have allowed scientists to peer into a rich coastal environment, where seabirds fished along the cliffs and strange whales foraged and hunted in the shallows. This was a land where birds such as Ramphastosula, a toucan-like animal related to modern boobies and gannets, dived into waters after fish that were stalked by Leviathan, a gigantic macropredatorial sperm whale that could rival Megalodon in both strength and size. The shorelines were occupied by colonies of semi-aquatic sloths, known as Thalassocnus, who dived in and out of coastal waves looking for vegetation. When they dived, they would have encountered the extremely odd Odobenocetops, a whale with tusks that had convergently evolved to resemble a walrus. This was a particularly unique ecosystem, unlike any other on Earth at the time. Moving inland, the terror birds dominated much of the open grassland of the continent. Among the largest of the Pliocene stock were Devin senzia, a 2.5 meter or 8 foot tall carnivorous bird from Argentina that was robustly built yet capable of terrifying bursts of speed. Its narrow body, long legs, flexible neck and hooked beak would have made formidable tools to help it hunt in this open, dry environment, where it ruled until well into the early Pleistocene. Before the arrival of saber-toothed cats in South America, another group of unusual predators dominated their ecosystems: marsupials. Animals such as Thylacosmilus, a marsupial sparacodont, known from northern Argentina, proved in the early Pliocene that saber teeth were an efficient weapon. Its sabers were huge, curved, tusk-like fangs that projected downwards from its upper jaw. Despite its fearsome appearance, it was just shy of 1.5 meters in length, or just under 5 feet. Just like a saber-toothed cat, it would have held down its prey using its large limb and neck muscles, before delivering a single precise bite to the windpipe, quickly killing its target to minimize the struggle. The herbivores in Pliocene South America were just as unconventional as the carnivores. Josepho artigasia was amongst the most unusual, a gigantic rodent that measured in extreme cases over 2.5 meters or in excess of 8.5 feet in length. This makes this animal the largest rodent of all time, which is quite surprising when you consider that its closest living relatives are the humble pacaranas, small forest-dwelling rodents that live in South America today. They shared their environment with Noto ungulates, a group of strange hoofed animals found only in South America that included the rhinoceros-like toxodontids, as well as ground sloths and glyptodonts. Many of these animals would become much more familiar with the subsequent species of the Pleistocene as they spread out into North America. One of the more unusual animals of Pliocene South America, known from Argentina, Venezuela and Colombia in the early stages of the epoch, was Chapel melania. At first glance, you might think that this creature was a type of bear, and that's exactly how it was first identified when it was named by Florentino Ameghino in 1908. Further studies, however, revealed that this animal was in fact a gigantic procyanid, a relative of modern-day raccoons. Comparable in size to the American black bear, Chapelmelania was capable of reaching weights of between 175 to 181 kilograms, or between 276 to 399 pounds. It is one of the animals that migrated from North America to South America when the two continents became connected, and was able to grow so large on account of its ability to exploit many food sources in its new home. Being omnivorous, much like a bear, would have meant that Chapelmelania didn't need to come into direct competition with terror birds or predatory marsupials, and it could likely hold its own against either if attacked. Bite marks that have been assigned to Chapelmelania have been found on the carcasses of glyptodonts, large armoured relatives of modern armadillos, but this is likely evidence of scavenging rather than predation. It's hard to imagine a world without humans, when we're such a prominent species today, but the fossils of the Pliocene allow us to glimpse into that reality. Without humans to overhunt or compete with the animals of this cooling world, large predators could become even larger, while strange new groups of mammals began to prosper in the woodlands and on the plains. Life in the seas was beginning to take shape as we know it today, while our earliest australopithecine ancestors first began to climb down from the trees in the African Rift Valley. It was a time of change, and the world was poised to become even more chaotic when the Ice Age would arrive and encourage the evolution of megafauna. In just a few million years following the Pliocene, humans would have spread out across the world, revolutionizing ecosystems wherever they went. It was surely an odd yet interesting time in the Earth's recent geological history.